Welcome, everybody, to our quarterly Standing Panel on Technology Leadership uh, webinar or webcast. We're very excited, Teresa and I. We kind of mapped things out, and we were very fortunate to find ourselves with some very current topics. We would love to take credit for the timeliness of this. But imagine a conversation, digital modernization for government, time for action. And we added those last words. Um, and the reason why this was chosen is that we were made aware of a fantastic report that was put together by the IBM Center for the Business of Government. And so let me share with you who we are, for those of you unfamiliar. Both Teresa and I are co-chairs of the standing panel, and we try to tackle issues at the high end when it comes to governance and policy, the big issues that are affecting everybody. And of course, technology is playing a much greater role than ever before. So with that, I alluded to this publication, and I want to share with you that there are 4 authors. The name of it is Digital Modernization for Government. This is something that can be downloaded from the IBM Center for the Business of Government. It is one of the better reports I've read because this is one that fits home to what I do in life every day. And I know the same is true with Teresa. But these are the 4 authors that played the greatest role, whose names appear in this report. It provides, and this is their subhead, an implementation framework. And so, whoop, boy, it's jumping around. Sorry. Um, what I want to do is kind of make this somewhat interactive. There will be an opportunity for you to weigh in with questions, but we're very fortunate to have Jim Denford, Professor of Management Information Systems, Royal Military College of Canada, join us. And we have our good friend Dan Chenoweth, Executive Director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Others were not available for this time period, but I'm assured that they can more than carry the ball in our discussion today. So we have a lot of interesting questions. There's never been probably a more opportune time to talk about it. To me, the backdrop is when Elon Musk recently said that he believes that we can get rid of 50% of the entire federal workforce and replace much of those mechanisms with artificial intelligence. So certainly digital modernization, however we interpret it, is on everyone's minds today. So I would like to actually turn to Dan for a moment. Um, Let me stop sharing. We're not ready for discussion yet. Um, Normally, the center comes up with a research agenda. When was this on your radar to put forth as a study worth pursuing? I just want to set the stage for this because the timeliness it cannot be understated.
Well, certainly thanks, Alan. It's a pleasure to be back with the standing panel. You and Teresa do terrific work leading it, and great to talk with Jim on behalf of the other authors of this paper, and look forward to the discussion. The center's had a long research topic that's focused on digital modernization since before it was modern, probably. And we've actually worked with either in combination or individually with 3 of the 4 authors previously on multiple reports on various different topics related to modernization frameworks, CIO-led modernization, et cetera. We have the way most of our research gets conducted is that academics will look at our research agenda, which is based on topics that government leaders tell us are things they need to know more about. And then we go to the field in a peer-reviewed journal article type process. And we actually we do a call for papers essentially. And we get ideas in, and then we kind of fund the best ones. And about a year, maybe a couple of years ago, we had some personal issues that one of the authors had to address. So it was a little longer than we normally take. But about a couple of years ago, Jim and his co-authors proposed this study for us. And we have been at IBM also partnered with the Academy on something called the Agile Government Center, which brings together people from around the country and indeed around the world on how to bring the tenets of Agile out of the software world and into sort of the larger program and policy modernization world. And as agencies think about adjusting, and as the new administration comes in with its priorities to move quickly, that was certainly an issue that we looked at as significant 2 years ago. And the methodology that Jim and the co-authors put together was very strong, which is not surprisingly because they've written for us before. They've always done a great job. So it was an easy call. They went to the top of the pile. And we, as with most of our research, we kind of let the authors do their work, and we are helpful as they need in terms of the research as it proceeds. But then we kind of work with them very closely at the end to kind of turn the report into the document that you posted on the screen that's available on the center's website, publicly available. And that's how we got here.
Well, timeliness is everything in this one. So, Jim, looking back and seeing what's going on both in our country, your country, uh, what excites you the most looking back? Um, and what would you change, if anything, based on what we're seeing today, if anything?
So I would say that the most exciting thing is we were writing this, and we had actually written it just as kind of a standalone proposal that went to Dan and the fantastic folk at the IBM Center for the Business of Government. But when we actually dug our feet into it a little bit, we found that it was actually coming out as a synthesis of a lot of the work we had done previously, almost over a decade of work which we actually had done in areas such as CAO-led innovation, in areas like challenge.gov, AI. So all of these things kind of just came together for us in this particular paper. So the excitement for me is in seeing all these various strands actually show up in this particular IBM Business of Government report. And you can actually see it when you go through it, is there is a callback to a number of different studies, both the work we've done with IBM Business of Government, Center for the Business of Government, and Brookings, and our academic papers as well. So that was really exciting for me. The things that I would change, we had anticipated, we had not, in fact, anticipated the funding and personnel pressures currently been experienced by federal agencies. Okay, I'm going to lead with that right now. We'd rather had expected baseline budgets to stabilize, potentially grow modestly with a trajectory of inflation reduction and GDP growth. The reason that this is important in the way that we approached it is because one of the figures that we came out with was about 80 to 90% of the spend in agencies on IT is very much focused on the legacy side of things, keeping the lights on within their technology stack. And so that means that compressions of as little as 10% of operating budgets can actually eliminate the space and the capacity the agency has to be able to innovate either in a modernization or a transformation space. And so that's kind of the first thing that had we been a little bit more prescient, we would have maybe said, okay, what happens when you start to actually decrease budgets as opposed to maintain or increase them? Second thing, we couldn't have foreseen the potential elimination of agencies and folding of their functions into existing ones, such as what's been proposed for USAID into the State Department. And what we're seeing in that, and what we'd expect, is it's very similar to the private sector. It's the public sector equivalent, I would say, of a merger and acquisition, which has tremendous challenges to technology leadership. And from the infrastructure all the way through the data and the client-facing applications. So what would we change? We might have looked a bit more at dynamic and fluid environments rather than the stable and static ones we were expecting.
Yeah, and of course, to bring that even closer to home, who would have imagined that U.S. Digital Service or even 18F would be eliminated? And these were the two engines for innovation for government.
Absolutely. We studied actually 18F in about 10 years ago and it was new at that particular point. And we had already seen some very quick wins of bringing technical experts in from Silicon Valley to be able to have these fellowships for like 2 years, 3 years, and then to go back to industry. And again, a very cost-effective mechanism to be able to deliver great advances on program with individuals who are just in touch with the leading edge of technology.
So that brings me to a follow-up question. When we look at the theme of the report, you talk about digital modernization and you talk about digital transformation. And I guess as I view this, it's like two concentric circles where there's a little bit of an overlap. Um, how do you balance this? And should we be putting more emphasis on one or the other? I mean, how should managers, public managers, be viewing that? Because some look at these are two different things, or they're one and the same.
So I don't believe they're one and the same. I do believe that they exist on a continuum of change in the digital environment for organizations. If we look at digital modernization, it's really the IT housekeeping that we have to do. So we have the legacy systems. At some point, we have to look at them to make sure that they are still fit for purpose and still secure. And so this is upgrading and scaling of existing IS systems to keep up with either internal or external pressures on the business processes for that particular agency. So again, big focus on operational efficiency and maintaining service quality. But when we start looking at the digital transformation sphere, it's about how do we actually leverage digital affordances to redefine how we do business within government, how we accomplish the tasks of the agency. And so this can either be building entirely new digital systems, which have significant implications on how the work is done, or it can be we significantly modify the way that we're doing the delivery. Again, it's very much focused on introducing those new technologies such as AI, new business models, new organizational processes, and how we interact with the customer. And so I'll go back to that original statement there, while they're often viewed as two different things, I think they're actually on a continuum. And we can tend to actually maybe have an intention to start off on a modernization path, but all of a sudden we find an opportunity and we can move into a transformation mode. Or if we're in a transformation and find that our infrastructure isn't up for it, we may have to move more towards modernization to get us to the point where we actually launch into a transformation mode. But so I think they are very much intertwined.
Yeah, Alan, one of the
Yeah.
papers that another of the co-authors, Greg Dawson, wrote a few years ago for us talked about this very issue around two-speed modernization processes, where you kind of transform, settle, modernize, get to the next phase, transform, settle, modernize. Part of the dilemma facing not just federal government but government in general is that the way that the government buys technology treats them the same by and large. So you have the same budget rules apply to experimental digital modernization, prototyping, et cetera, as they do to O&M. You often have that even in the same contract. Whereas a commercial model might say, all right, let's do the agile digital modernization experimentation with like a group of partner vendors in a sandbox, and we'll have more patient capital that's tolerant of failure there. We'll learn from that, and then we'll use that to feed into an O&M contract where you have sort of a lower ROI for the company because it's a longer tail on the O&M. But government doesn't necessarily spend money to incentivize industry to operate in the way that, as Jim describes, as best practice in industry.
So that leads me to the issue of how do you get these things to move? And that raises the question of leadership. And so when I think of leadership, I mean, clearly, I think we know leadership, there's got to be a sense of leadership somewhere to ensure this successful digital modernization within government. Where does it come from? And what are some of the challenges today as we see it?
So I would say that leadership's always paramount importance in having successful initiatives. I mean, it's a truism that employees don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses, right? So a good leader can make the most demanding job under horrible conditions actually be tolerable, while a poor leader can make the best job drudgery and misery for an individual. So I think actually that the number of considerations that we identify within the report speak directly to the types of leaderships we need in CIOs and other technology leaders. You must be realistic, but also be inventive in stretching the scarce results you have at the agency level to be able to achieve the desired outcomes for your agency head. You have to have a strong understanding of the agency architecture, both the as-is architecture and the to-be able to balance the modular and monolithic systems that you're going to find across any agency technology stack. You must put people at the center of the decisions, and whether they're the citizens that you're serving, the agency staff, or the legislatures who are providing you the resources and the direction. And you have to remain curious and learning focused. So there's kind of different places you can see people coming from. So some of our previous research has focused on that career CIOs can outperform these rock star CIOs who are dropped in directly into senior positions from the private sector. So we found that the career CIOs actually do better, and a lot of that has to do with their learning of the systems. But I want to be careful in discussing this because there can and should be movement back and forth from the public and private sectors. And we've already used 18F as a fantastic example of that, how short stints in government service can be beneficial because you can bring in new ideas. I think a lot of it comes down to attitude, however. And so one of our individuals we discussed this with was the CIO for Arizona, J.R. Sloan. And he came in after 20 years in the private sector, started off at the DMV in Arizona as the agency CIO, then moved up through the state deputy CIO job to become eventually the CIO about 5 years ago. And moving in from industry, he, preconceived notions about what public service was, but found that the vast majority of staff, smart, motivated, trying to move the needle under tremendous constraints. And so he took his task to find to keep them motivated and to learn the government system so he could clear obstacles for them and then adapt and apply what he'd learned in the private sector. If you come in as one of these rock star CEOs thinking you're there to tear up government, you're going to fail. And I think that his case, Mr. Sloan's case, was a textbook case of successful private to public leadership evolution. I do believe, though, that there is a lot that goes on that is unique within the public sector, that once you understand that context, you will be a better leader within the public sector context.
And can I add that the incentive structure for leaders really often kind of dictates how successful they are. Right in the private sector, everyone has a similar alignment of incentives that sort of stem from revenue, profit, sales, and sort of how that feeds into the business cycle. Obviously, there are a different set of imperatives in government, but even starting with that set of imperatives, it's not evenly understood from the leader down to their staff, to the contractors that they're working with, their business partners, what those incentives are and what the risks and rewards are around achieving or not achieving them. So the performance evaluation of somebody working for the leader may not be the same, and often isn't the same as the leader's standards. And that may not be the same as the contractor providing the technology service. So good leaders need good structures to implement their leadership and sort of carry it out, which government often lacks in terms of a coherent strategy.
So if we were to take it up a notch, I certainly understand the conversation about CIOs. That's an area that I spent a bit of time with. But what about the champions above them, the department heads? They're the ones, and I worry because many of them want to do the right thing, and very often it's like, I don't know what I don't know. I'm not sure what I don't know what's possible. I don't know how to set up an environment for innovation to occur. And I think it starts there, doesn't it, in many ways? Because we don't want to put the burden totally on the CIO to be the leader of all transformation. Somebody has to support that through budget, through governance, and the like. What are your thoughts about establishing or building champions above the CIO level so that they're more plugged in of what's possible and what are perhaps best practices that they should be thinking about
So
as a framework generally?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Jim can add, and maybe there's also some lessons from Canada here that we could learn from as well. Since the Klinger-Cohen Act, which is I think most people know the statute that kind of established CIOs in the U.S., the concept has been that they act as the agency head's technology advisor, but that from a governance framework, it's the agency head that's accountable. And too often in government, especially until probably 10 or 15 years ago, this was especially true. People just kind of thought as the technologies, that's the CIO's job, and I don't have to worry too much about it. Now, and certainly, in the last 6 weeks, this has become rampantly true in the US. Technology is in everything, and it's something that's discussed at the very highest levels of government, up to and including the president and senior White House officials in the US. And so, so this fully concur with the premise of your question, Alan. The issue then becomes one of governance, and how do you establish a a framework where agency heads are, receiving the information they need from their CIO, their chief technology officer, potentially their chief digital officer, chief cybersecurity officer, and other chiefs, which is part of the issue around governance conflagration in terms of many, many chiefs. But getting that information to the agency head so they can be supportive, redirect resources toward, fixing a problem, or redirect resources towards something that's performing well and away from something that's not, because the CIO can't really control that. You need not just the agency head, but like the CFO working with the acquisition officer, et cetera, in a frame. And that's something that I think you're seeing government move more toward, and especially when it has to move at breakneck speed, like is occurring now, working with new organizations like the Doge, which are coming in and creating sort of a new framework for modernization. That type of communication is really necessary for success.
Yeah, we're learning the new phrase, 100-hour weeks.
I would just add to that. We did a study specifically in the FCC a few years ago, looking at their processes and how they were creating an environment that was open to innovation, particularly in the digital sphere. And I think there's really two aspects to that I want to focus on. The first is our kind of switch as a community from looking at information technology to discussing digital as a phenomenon. Digital implies the inexorable move towards the intertwining, or the things that are born being both technical and procedural at the same time. When I think about 30 years ago, when I was doing a regional CIO job within the Army, it was very much you as the G6 are reactive, or the CIO are reactive to the needs of the operational people and that. And so it was very much a sequential process, whereas with digital, those two things are born together. And therefore, I think that means that the top technology individual within the agency, albeit a CTO, a CIO, as chief digital officer, et cetera, has got to be an even closer ally and supporter to the agency head than they have been previously. And the reason is because the agency head's success is going to be based upon the digital face that's put onto that particular agency, because more and more of the services are being delivered in that particular format.
So this was something that was mentioned earlier about our choices and our dependency on the vendor community. Everything needs to be off the shelf, so to speak. I think very few government agencies have the appetite to develop their own homegrown systems. But that raises a question, because there are so many new names and entrants. I go to some of these meetings and I'm looking at alphabetically challenging names, and I'm trying to, how do I pronounce, what is that? It's a very new vendor community that is emerging. So with that, many people take comfort in dealing with the established vendors that they know. But then there's a lot of folks that the new people on the block. And so when you talk about new vendors versus established vendors, when it comes to digital initiatives, what should people be looking for, and how can they take comfort? Because, the idea of government is to mitigate risk.
It's a really good question, and I think we can use AI as an example of that, as we did in the report. We've been looking for about 5 or 6 years at AI, the AI phenomena, and in fact, we did a series in Brookings Institution on the changes to the federal ecosystem for AI. And so we saw an inflection point in about 2023. So if we look at the amount of funds obligated at the federal level, it went from about 200 million from 2017 to 2022 to almost 700 million in the 2023-2024 budget year. The potential award values grew from about 350 million in the same time frame to over $4.5 billion. And the biggest growth in that was in Department of Defense. DoD went from about 270 to about $4.3 billion in a 1 year as to the size of the potential contracts in that. At the same time, if we think about that's the demand side, and the supply side, we saw the number of vendors with over $10 million contracts grow from 4 to over 200. And so what does that mean? Well, what it means when you have any new market, you all of a sudden see a rushing in of individuals or in companies. And the majority of the companies that we saw initially were small companies, small cap companies. And so a lot of those ones are individuals who left bigger companies to be able to start up their own, and had these great ideas. And we saw a huge number of one-to-one contracts. So there was one agency, and that agency was the only major contract at the federal level for that company, those startups. And so there was a lot of capture of those startups by those particular agencies. Now, when we start to look at the benefits, the costs and benefits within that, well, established vendors, familiarity, good track records, deep understanding of government procurement processes, which is really important when it comes to reducing risk and insurance compliance. Downside, less inventive, less collaborative than small businesses, new small businesses. So startups and tech disruptors, they're more innovative, more agile, but in some cases they don't understand how to actually work within the government system, and so it's more difficult. So lack of experience can be a kind of a hard thing on that one. Now, there's a couple of different mitigations. The first is you may wish to kind of divide the two. If you're going to establish vendors for stability and reliability, or new vendors for innovation and agility, or a more complex integrative way that you can do it is you can start building ecosystems of collaboration. And what you do then is you start creating open data platforms, some sandbox environments, innovation labs, which can build a space within the agency where traditional and non-traditional vendors can actually meet and work co-developed solutions. Therefore, you can balance and benefit from the stability of those established vendors, at the same time bring in some of that innovation and agility of the startups and newer vendors.
So in terms of your framework, and anyone who's ever planned any kind of new program, whether it's modernization or putting band-aids on legacy systems, we always get into the age-old debate about agile versus waterfall. You mentioned that. I think it's important because this is part of your framework of thinking, and I think you talk about a hybrid approach, and you raise it. There are a couple of really important gems that I want to get to, and then we're going to open it up to everyone because I'm sure there's some questions from other folks here. But what are your thoughts about the differentiation between those two?
Yeah, like when I was on the practitioner side, I did both waterfall within the public sector and agile within it. I started adopting agile in about 2003, about 2 years after the Agile Manifesto was dropped, and it was great for doing the kind of small scale projects we were looking at doing then. I mean, as we know, agile is about quickly adapting to evolving requirements, whereas waterfall is about making sure that you've got the gateways and that. Now, the reason that we were kind of pushing towards ideas of hybrid, or I'll use the term wagile, which was one of our interviewees mentioned, was because for government projects, you have a requirement to be able to make sure that the fiduciary responsibilities to the taxpayer, the individuals who are paying the bills, citizens of the country, are met. And therefore, you need well-defined processes, thorough documentation, and robust oversight to be able to ensure that things are going well. However, a hybrid type approach is when once you've got through those gateways internal to the various steps, internal to the various cycles that you're going to be building, you can actually adopt agile methodologies to be able to actually meet the requirements within those particular levels. And so Wagile is one view of it. Another one is scaled agile frameworks, or SAFe, which allow for agile processes at the team level while maintaining an overall structured approach for the portfolio management. And we think that's probably one of the stronger ways that you can actually build these two together, particularly since there have been new procurement mechanisms over the last decade which have been introduced, which allow you to actually benefit from agile development methodologies in the government service.
Let me try to kind of put that in the context of actual infrastructure in an agency. So you've got oftentimes an agency has 10, 20, even 30-year-old mainframes, code base, in language like They probably isn't any Fortran anymore, but they're pretty close. COBOL, lots of older languages that some of us learned in school that are still running systems and doing a pretty good job of it, but aren't doing it as efficiently as it could be. But if you try to introduce like massive change at one time in a waterfall fashion, it would break the system. The risk of that could be much higher, and the cost of sort of fixing errors after the fact would be far greater. So another way to think about the agile approach, but I've always loved that term since I read it, is all right, let's think about a workload within the agency. Maybe it's the intake for citizens or even the authentication system they use to sign on to get a benefit. Let's actually modernize just that, and we won't worry about the back end yet. And then let's modernize the process by which they actually supply information once they're authenticated to reach a decision. So you're going to go from left to right in a process kind of diagram, and you modernize each one using technology, make sure that there's nothing that breaks at each point. And it allows you to maintain this kind of waterfall O&M, which is the durability of the system at a large scale, but also bring in these systems in somewhat of a structured fashion.
Great. Well, I think we'd all agree that for anybody coming into an agency, we have a lot of new entrants coming into the ranks of government. One of the things one has to do is assess what they have. Take an inventory, have a better sense of where things are before you start figuring out what needs to be changed or improved. But you use an interesting concept that I thought was interesting. I haven't heard it put in the way that it was described in your report. Knowing what time it is. I think that's a great concept. So if you could elaborate, I think we would all benefit from that.
Sure. And in fact, we don't own that one. That was brought up by one of our interviewees, and we thought it was a fantastic model, and so it definitely had a strong place in it. So the time model is: what do you tolerate? What do you improve? What do you migrate? And what do you eliminate? And this is a strategic framework that you can apply within agencies to evaluate and enhance different systems components. It enables you to allocate resources effectively, streamline your operations, and ensure you're meeting your objectives there. So again, if you think about these four key actions, you can apply them to the different systems you have in your technology stack. So when we talk about tolerate, this is, okay, does a system not meet the ideal performance standards, but it's still functional enough for us to be able to retain in the short term? It's not saying that we like it, but we're saying that we can actually live with it because it doesn't critically hinder our operations. And so we maintain these things to avoid any unnecessary disruptions or excessive costs because we can actually live with it. And so therefore we can, if we know we can live with it, but we want to change it later, we can actually allocate resources to more urgent areas that we need to actually fix. And then put it on the list for future replacement. So improve then becomes those that we have significant potential, but require some enhancement to be able to reach their performance potential. So this can mean updating technologies, enhancing the workforce skills, refining policies, etc. This is really supports modernization, where we want to be able to do something better as opposed to a full systems overhaul, excuse me. So when you think about it, things like data security protocols, training staff and softwares, these can get efficiency gains without massive time and budget. So improvements increase your operational efficiency while maintaining which allow you to gradually modernize. If we think about migration, this is moving to new systems. And so this is when we really get into the hardcore management of new capabilities. And so we can transfer data to new systems. We can adopt cloud-based solutions, new policies to address shifting public needs. So we can move from paper-based to digital. We can adopt platforms that cross agencies for information sharing, et cetera. Now, these are generally more complex and resource is intensive, but they can help you from the perspective of scalability, accessibility, and responsiveness to the public. So the idea here is that these are the ones that you're going to actually focus your attention on. And then the last one's eliminate, because sometimes you don't have to do something anymore. And so if you are able to identify a system or parts of a system which are inefficient, redundant, or outdated, then you can retire these particular systems. And so by doing so, by systematically identifying those components that no longer serve purpose, you can simplify your system, you can reduce your technical debt, which is exceedingly important because that's your legacy part, and then you can reallocate those resources to high priority areas. And so we like the time model. We think it's one that we should look at when we look at what we have within our architecture, what's in our technology stack, and I think it's actually applicable to any environment.
Which leads me to a follow-up, and that is I'm sure when you began this endeavor, you were looking at this in terms of the federal government mostly, even though you drew from other sources. But now we're at a state where a lot of people strongly believe, that many of the federal functionality should be moved to the states. And that's already occurring. So the question is, how might this framework work for states? Is there any differences that you see? Is it an issue of scale, or do you find that this could easily be applied to a state agency as well as a federal agency?
So when we're talking about the transition, we're talking about devolution of powers or delegation of powers from the federal level to the state level. There's a number of different ways that can happen, right? You can have legislative changes where Congress passes law that reduce the federal role in certain areas, granting more power to the states. You can have block grants, which are moving the responsibility to the states without restrictions on how they are actually spent. You can just unfund mandates at the federal level, which kind of force the responsibility down to the state level. You can have executive orders, administrative actions out of the executive branch, which would modify regulations to give states more control, judicial decisions from the Supreme Court, or you can get into agreements at the intergovernmental level to be able to shift those responsibilities. Now, whichever of those kind of ways that you move the responsibilities, there's a number of things that you need to consider. First is and foremost is going to be you're asking the states to do more, which means that you're definitely going to be looking at state IT infrastructure upgrades. I don't know any state that has a massive overcapacity, which would allow them to be able to do new things without having the requirement to develop or update their own data systems to manage those new responsibilities, the infrastructure underlying them to do it. Decentralization of databases. We know that having a single federal database means that you have consistency within that data. Instead of having one centralized database, you're going to have 50 decentralized databases, which may have separate systems, which may have the same actor who moves from state to state, different data formats and standards, problematic. Interoperability, how you move information back and forth, reporting and compliance, and then cybersecurity. The more points of access you have to a system, the more issues you'll have. And so this is kind of a parallel to spin off our divestment within the private sector. So at the state level, it means either new developments or modernization and transformations of their existing systems to take on more. If federal funding accompanies the change, well, this could be used to provide infrastructure upgrades to the legacy stack, which would then allow you to build on top of that. But if it doesn't, it means more prioritization, which means less money to be able to do other priorities for the state. However, you're going to get into the same balance between modernization and transformation then.
I agree with that. You answered that very well. One of the things that comes up, we were talking about this before we went live, that many of us are in the teaching environment, and AI keeps coming up. Even though I try to change the subject, every one of our students, our future leaders, are very concerned about AI. So I'm going to turn to Teresa, who took your study and shared it with the class, and I'll let you take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Jim and Dan for being here and for this great report, this great discussion. So, as Alan said, I teach a seminar class. I am teaching this semester a seminar class in digital transformation. Right, leading leading digital transformation in the public sector. That's my course, and my students are primarily second-year MPA students. And they are very excited about artificial intelligence, learning about it, trying to understand how they can create public value, right? This is what I talk about with my students all the time, how to use new and emerging technologies organizational innovation, et cetera, to create public value. And but my course is not talking about that 80% or that legacy environment, right? So as we teach our classes, we're pushing the envelope. We're trying to prepare them to live in tomorrow's world, right? But as you point out in this report, there's so much of a balance that needs to be struck. So how can we best prepare our students beyond ensuring they read this report and having a conversation about what exactly do we mean when we say legacy systems, right? So that many of them don't even have a mental model that they can use to sort of get their head around what we're even talking about. So what are your thoughts about how do we think about both preparing our students for tomorrow and bringing them along to understand their roles and responsibilities for transforming or modernizing the systems that we created yesterday?
Yeah.
Hey, Teresa, what do you mean students who are like technology focused, like they're in the systems, or do you mean students that are learning about these programs that may or may not have like a tech background?
So I think it's a combination, right? So my students are students who are public administration, they're getting their MPAs, but they are concentrating in information technology management. So they've committed to being technology leaders, right? Some of them have technical training. A lot of them are very technically aware because they see themselves with a future in this space. So they're not programmers, right? They're not programmers. Yeah.
Okay, I'll defer to Professor. I'll defer to Professor Denford.
All right. For non-technical students, if we're looking at students who are either in business or in public administration, the way that I would normally approach that would be, when I'm talking about things like IT architecture, and that it can be rather esoteric for students, particularly if you're in a core business or public administration domain and not a technologist and that. And so I tend to use, when I talk about architecture, the parallels between IT architecture and architecture for a building. And so when approaching how to deal with architecture, how to deal with, the issue of the legacy technologies, I look behind me. There is a building, the buildings there were built in 1870. They're still functional today. However, those functions have changed over time. And so there have been things that have been modernized in them. There have been functions that have changed within those particular buildings, but the overall architecture, the exterior architecture, the scaffolding for it still exists, and it has to exist. And the reason is because we can either tear everything down and build it back up again, or we can work within the architecture that we have. We can work within the fundamentals of the structures that we have right now. And so discussing with them, how do you actually then, and you can even use the parallels of saying, how would you create a new building based upon having to keep the historical foundations of the old building and stuff? And that's really where we can start developing parallels for our students. And that is something they can actually identify with, and that if they're in a non-technical field.
Yeah, that's great. As you were making your remarks before, and you said, someone needs to come in, needs to understand the architecture. I was exactly thinking, okay, that's a challenge for some of our students. This especially if we need to get highly technical. But I do think this idea, even understanding at a very high level, that there are limits to what they can, in fact, quickly change or even slowly change, and it really does require this sort of level of understanding about the architecture. So that's great.
And they have to know what time it is, right?
And they have to know what time it is. Exactly. What are you going to fix? We don't have any heating in the building right now. Let's do that first. It's not something we can tolerate, and it's not something we can eliminate either.
Right. Right. And I think, Dan raised a good point about, we have some of these systems that are built on languages that our students, even some of the more non-traditional students, have never even heard of. Right. And so how do we the orientation that our next generation technology leaders may need to what we have in place and how AI can, in fact, help us modernize those systems. I think, this is my last module for the semester is AI in the public sector. I've been covering it all the way through as part of smart cities and other things. And maybe I'll invite you to join us for a half an hour. Thank you.
All right.
I think,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things for the students to understand is that the fun stuff is going to be in the minority. It's going to be a thin slice of your spend is going to be on the fun stuff, doing new things. I will go back to Dan's model that he was talking about there about once within Agile of being able to modernize particular business processes one at a time. This is where you're going to see your success. And this is where the Agile approach really wins out, I think, in this one, because you can identify based upon what's my backlog, right? Is that this is the most important thing right now. Let's go modernize that. And it may be that it gets taken out of the legacy part of the stack at that point. And it's something that we build either into our new data centers, on our new data centers, which are internal, or that goes to public cloud at that particular point. And it just becomes very top of stack, just being the application layer that we're really delivering ourselves in that. So I think there are ways to be able to do that. And that's one of the ways that we can gradually transition and in fact shrink the size of the legacy stack. And this is really where CIOs, CTOs have to focus on how we can actually get the functions and the data out of the legacy stack. Because if you can shrink the size of that part of your envelope, that's when you start to develop the big abilities to change. I'll give an example. Shared Services Canada was having a heck of a time getting traction here in Canada, and there were a few project failures, and that they were having difficulty getting the getting our original. When they started, there were 720 data centers, legacy data centers. They're down to about 200, but they've built 4 massive enterprise data centers in that. But it took them to get an influx of several $100 million to be able to get the capital to be able to start bringing things out into the cloud, to be able to break the back of the problem of how to start breaking the legacy part of the stack, that legacy spend. And so in a lot of cases, we're moving things because they're more efficient, they're more cost efficient in that. There are going to be some times where you have to actually bump that it becomes less efficient for a spell until you can get rid of some of the legacy parts of your technology, of your architecture, to move on. As it does require legislators to be able to go, we're going to bite the bullet, and for these 2 years, we're going to see an increase in spend to be able to get rid of these particular parts, which are causing us problems.
Excellent point. All right, I'm going to open it up to anyone who has a comment or I have more questions, but I want to make sure that we allow others to join in. Does anybody have a comment or question for either Dan or Jim? Yes, Barbara.
Yeah, I just thank you so much, Alan. And this is a great discussion. I just put it up in the chat, but I might as well just say it. Teresa, I loved your comment about using AI to create public value. And it just strikes me that that's the starting point. That is, in all of these cases, in the public sector and in any sector, the first thing is, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? And technology then becomes a great enabler. And as technology advances, our abilities become even greater to address problems. So it was alluded to in a number of the comments here about the vendors, the technology producers working arm in arm with those in the public sector that are actually trying to solve real problems in the world, so that there's greater understanding of what it is that the agency is trying to do as the technology is being prescribed, and using all of these various processes. So I'd just like for folks to talk a little bit more about that. That is, with the starting point being the problem to be solved, the agency's purpose, how the vendors, how the leaders, and the people who are actually on the front lines of trying to get things done work together to design and apply increasingly sophisticated and fast changing technology. Just one more comment and then I'll shut up. It seems like often the case is that the vendors lead, they don't follow. A new glitzy technology is available and we try to figure out how to make it work in our agency, as opposed to it being the other way around, that the technology follows the purpose, form follows function. So I'll stop there.
So since I work for a large technology provider, I will start off. So I think you're absolutely right, Barbara. The goal ought to be like, what's the use case that we're trying to make better on behalf of the citizen or the small business or the farmer, or whoever is, the person on the defense battlefield, whoever we are trying to serve through a government system. And then how do we align players in government and industry to produce a result that achieves that outcome? And too often, and I come back to a point I made earlier, the incentives are misaligned. So the contractor may be building a system for something that doesn't directly relate to the problem that the program leaders actually got the money for. But by the time it went through technology and procurement staff in the agency, what came out of the other side as requirements that the vendor's building toward aren't exactly what the program leader needs. And so you have a suboptimal kind of technology result that is a misuse of, it's sort of the waste part of fraud, waste, and abuse. It's a misuse of taxpayer dollars. So I think that you're exactly right. Establishing those requirements clearly and then propagating them through the incentive structures that government and industry face in a way that parallels and doesn't kind of diverge them toward they're working toward kind of different endpoints, is a way that you could achieve the kind of results you're describing and have the government industry partnership work in consonance, not in disconsonance.
And I would say that I agree completely with everything Dan said. You have to start with the service being delivered in mind. What is the effect that you're trying to have? What are you trying to provide to the citizen who's interacting with the agency? One of the worst things you can do is have someone say, well, we need AI. No, you don't need AI. You don't need a technology. You match your technology. You fit your technology to what you need. What you need is consistency in service delivery. You need low-cost service delivery. You need service delivery that's available online. Those things can lead you to the conclusion that there is an underlying technology such as generative AI or RPA that may be able to help you in those things. But it's the service being delivered that has to lead and not the technology.
Thank you.
Great point. Anyone else have a question or a comment?
Yeah, well, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah. I edited a journal called the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration, and we did a special issue in December on digital transformation. We have one of our authors on the feed, Pallavi Awasthi from the Huizinga School. I want to say I may be pronouncing that wrong, but from in Florida. But one of the impressions I developed looking at, she did a paper on India and digital transformation. We had another one on from Japan, maybe a couple from Japan, and my sense was that the U.S. is behind many of these developing or less developed countries. And I'm wondering whether I'm correct in that assessment, that we are moving very slowly in digital transformation. I've got another paper coming out in a future issue from Japan where the author talks about 5 different transformative technologies that puts the customer in charge and serves the customer more directly. But could you assess where the U.S. sits relative to other countries with respect to digital transformation, and if we're behind, why?
So I won't assess over that, but I can point towards the e-government development index, and the 2024, the US is 20th in the world on that. Canada, by the way, is 47th or 48th, so we don't have much to be able to brag about there either. But I think that there is grounds for improvement in the West broadly, and that we did a study actually on the AI side of things specifically, and we found that the two leaders are the US and China in AI. The US has been China has been very much more focused on development of capability, whereas Western nations, including the US, have been including the provision of guardrails to make sure that it is used ethically and that this is not a concern that all parts of the world share. That we are using our artificial intelligence appropriately. And this actually links back to Barbara's question and Teresa's as well about the use of AI, in that responsibility and accountability for the use of these systems is going to be a key thing we need to think about, because that then links to ethics and it links to public trust in the systems. We get back to the talk of AI and the use of it for client-facing or citizen-facing systems, and that we need very much to be aware that we need trust in those systems for them to be used. And that means that ultimately the responsibility and accountability for the decisions that are being made by those systems don't rest in the systems themselves. They actually rest within a human decision maker somewhere. Someone somewhere is going to have to be accountable for those decisions. And that's why in the report we talk about things like having a recourse mechanism for citizens to be able to challenge what's being delivered through AI, and et cetera.
Good, thanks.
I would say, Jim, it's often within governments, there's a lot of variance. So in the US, there are states that are doing great work. There's cities, there's even agencies within the federal government or parts of agencies that are doing great work that's often leading edge internationally. And then there are other parts that are even further behind the number 20. So it's those composites, I think, are important diagnostics of trends. There are examples of leadership happening all over the government. In fact, I'll give Pallavi a shout out and a preview of coming attractions, because she's done a report that we hope to be publishing soon that's going to talk about some of the sort of key characteristics that leaders can adopt to succeed more in a more agile fashion and achieve the kinds of results that Jim and I described. So Pallavi, I hope that's a good setup.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I just wanted to, of course, make a comment here, as Jim was just mentioning about the study which I did in the Indian context, and of course, Jim Perry and Jim Denford, what you were mentioning about, US leading in AI and, all of this new emerging technology innovation which is coming up. So when comparing the India context, so in the Indian context, there has been a lot of innovation which has been national government led. So what they are taking an approach, so there are when we talk about open innovation, there are three different approaches that are becoming popular in the literature, and also a lot of it also comes from the technology environment. So when you think about open innovation, it could be either fully government led, it could be either fully private led. We don't yet have the models which are hybrid. An Indian context where the national leadership is really taking the lead is building a hybrid open innovation model. So a good example is their unified payment interface, which actually is a hybrid model where government initiated and created a new infrastructure, which is a non-profit organization, which kind of then collaborated with various ministries, public sector innovators, private sector innovators, and they all came together to create this kind of a new digital payment infrastructure, which is been a path-breaking innovation in the Indian context, because in India there are billion plus population, kind of context where you have penetrating, especially in the middle and the lower middle class, and also the rural India has been very complicated pre-COVID, but post-COVID, when this technology was evolving, it kind of expanded very quickly. So these kind of models, when you compare, of course, US is leading in AI infrastructure development, and of course, more of it also comes from the availability of funding and a lot more stronger technology infrastructure which has been in US for a long time. So when we really look at all of these different approaches, I think there are lots of interesting lessons to be learned when we talk about technology leadership and how these different learning environments can kind of contribute. And we still don't yet give a lot more value to the these countries like India or others, Japan and China as well, where these kind of new emerging approaches are coming up, which are very different what we really emphasize in the US context, because in US it's mostly private led. Government has still been quite behind in leading innovation and creating this kind of a new ecosystem or environment.
And I'll just say that again, my intent was not to minimize the contribution of India. In fact, the US government has partnered with India with GPAI, Trust Initiative, and other ones as well. And this has been a very, there has been recognition that that it is a growing capability as well. So for sure, there is huge growth there.
Yeah, of course. I wasn't, of course, pointing you out, Jim, but it just was
Looking
bringing the
forward
two
to reading these
perspectives.
two IBM reports, Dan.
Exactly.
Oh,
So
they're
one of the
great.
things, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting as well is sort of, that there's a priority on citizen services. In non-US contexts, I think at multiple levels, different levels of government, we see different commitments to service, citizen-centered services. But I think my experience in working outside the US and in different countries was that we did see a difference in terms of the centering of the citizen, and it was less about technology innovation and more about service innovation, which happened to require technological innovation. And I think, in the US, we focus a lot on technological innovation in the interest of efficiency and effectiveness. This broad sweeping comment, I get that, right? But I think one of the other, sort of an enabling factor is the greenfield, right? So we've talked a lot about legacy system, right? And so in a lot of the places where I've spent in the Middle East and in Africa, what we're doing is we're creating systems anew. And we're doing those systems were being created with this very service oriented, very citizen service orientation, in a way that we don't have often the latitude. Now, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I think, we don't, the systems often limit our ability to transform the focus of those systems from an efficiency and effectiveness to a service strategy. So anyway, just a little commentary, but I do think that this conversation about modernization and legacy is part of this larger conversation. Where can the US and Canada, maybe other developed nations, how do we overcome our existing infrastructures or transform them in a way that we can create new citizen-centered services programs?
We're running out of time, but I love this conversation. It reminds me, I'm haunted by a city manager who once told me, he said, I would love to have more citizen services. I know that probably people would enjoy that, but I don't have to do it. And what he was basically saying is, I am not a retail store. I'm not a private company. People aren't going to move because the services are not at the level they would really like. And he said, I have other competing demands for the dollar.
Exactly.
People don't want to pay more in taxes. Basically, what he was saying is, I know we could do this, but he was asking not how, but why. And I just thought that was interesting. So another discussion, another day. But I just want to remind everybody that this has been recorded. You may want to share this discussion with others in your organization. We at the Academy will certainly publicize it. I want to thank both Dan and Jim for their time. I want to really commend you. This is an excellent report. And if you haven't gotten the message, download the report. This is definitely worth a read. A lot of actionable information in it. It is well thought out and it's well illustrated. So it's very readable and it's just a great study. And we're glad we were able to help get the word out. And hopefully there will be a lot of new folks coming into government, because my hope, who's going to read it besides us? I think take it, not only read it for yourself, share it with those that you know, because I think it's a great nonpartisan framework that I think that will have great value, regardless of where one lives. So with that,
Thanks, Alan. We really appreciate coming on to talk about it.
Very much.
Jim is one of 4 tremendous authors, and so kudos to the team. And for those of you that are, teaching, I'd add students to your list of people to share it with.
yes.
For our
Well,
future leaders.
Teresa's
And
already
the
there.
next
I
one.
intend to do it too. So there we are. All right. Thanks,
And we'll be
everybody.
looking forward to the next one, Pallavi, that we can share with our students as well.
Of course, and I couldn't agree more with your comment on citizen services and the technology led. And I think that's where is the difference. When I was doing the India study and comparing both, it truly is. So interesting. Hopefully, you do justice to this discussion. Thank you.
All
Bye.
right.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for
much for the
joining us, everyone.
invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Cheers.